Jeff Beck gave a lot of interviews over the course of his career. He talked about the Yardbirds, about his tone, about the evolution of rock guitar. But there was one night he almost never brought up on his own. Journalists had to ask, and when they did, Beck would go quiet. Not the polite pause of someone gathering words, but the longer kind. The kind that told you the answer was still somewhere close to the surface. Decades later, unresolved. He saw Jimi Hendrix play in late 1966. He had seen plenty of guitarists before that night. He would see many after. But that particular night left something in him that the years never quite dissolved. London in the autumn of 1966 was moving fast. British rock had spent the better part of a decade constructing a hierarchy, unspoken but understood by everyone inside it. You earned your place through years of woodshedding, through calluses and blues history absorbed so deeply, it stopped being knowledge and became instinct. The guitarists at the top didn't get there by accident. They got there by being the best in every room they walked into. Jeff Beck had walked into a lot of rooms, and he had been the best in most of them. At 22, he was already considered one of the 2 or 3 finest guitarists in England. The Yardbirds had launched him into the conversation that Clapton had started, and Beck had carried it somewhere new. His tone was unlike anything British rock had produced. Raw, aggressive, technically precise in ways that shouldn't have coexisted with that much aggression. Other guitarists studied him the way a student studies a difficult text, not for pleasure, for instruction. Beck knew this. He wore it quietly, the way people wear things they've stopped needing to say out loud. That autumn, a name had started circulating in London's music circles. An American guitarist, barely known outside small venues in New York and Seattle, had arrived in the city with his manager, Chas Chandler, formerly of the Animals. The name was Jimi Hendrix. Beck had heard it once or twice. He hadn't paid it much attention. American blues guitarists came through London regularly. He didn't expect to be surprised. One evening in November, Beck found himself at a small venue in central London. A gathering of musicians, producers, a few journalists, everyone moving between rooms. Beck was there with friends. No particular agenda. Then someone mentioned that Hendrix was in the building, that Chandler had arranged for him to sit in for a song. Beck positioned himself near the stage, drink in hand, watching with the detached attention of someone who expected to be mildly impressed and then move on. Jimi walked out carrying a white Stratocaster. He was dressed unlike anyone Beck had seen on a British stage. Layers of color, a scarf, rings on his fingers, something theatrical in his presence before he'd played a single note. Beck noticed the outfit the way he'd noticed the weather. Mildly, without significance. Then Jimi plugged in, and before he played a note, he reached down and connected a small device between his guitar cable and his amplifier, a wah pedal. Beck recognized it immediately. He'd seen the Vox unit before. A recent piece of gear, still a novelty among serious players. A tone filter activated by a rocker pedal. It created a sweep of frequencies that, in most hands, sounded like exactly what it was. A gadget, something you used once or twice for effect, and then set aside in favor of real technique. Beck had tried one briefly, found it interesting for about an afternoon, and then put it away. It was a gimmick, the kind of thing you reach for when you didn't have enough to say with your hands alone. He would think about that assessment later, many times. Jimi stood at the microphone, looked at the backing musicians, and said 2 words. "Hey, Joe." They nodded. He nodded back. And then he started to play. The first thing Beck noticed was the presence. The way Jimi's guitar filled every corner of the room before he'd done anything technically impressive. Something in the way the amplifier breathed, the way the strings responded to his touch. It felt like a different instrument than the one Beck had been playing his whole life. And then the wah pedal started moving. Beck watched Jimi's right foot. It rocked slowly at first, almost lazily, following the opening riff, but not the way most players used it, as a decorative accent on top of what the hands were doing. The pedal was shaping the phrasing, responding to the melody, anticipating the next note before Jimi's fingers had moved to find it, as if the pedal and the hands were having a conversation, and the guitar was translating it in real time into something that sounded less like an instrument and more like a voice. Beck didn't move. He stopped lifting his drink. He just watched. Jimi's voice came in. Low, unhurried, warm in a way that seemed to contradict the electricity coming out of the amplifier. As he sang, his foot kept moving on the pedal, bending the tone of each chord beneath the vocal line, creating a second voice underneath the words, something that answered the lyric without speaking, a frequency conversation below the surface of the song that most people probably didn't consciously notice, but felt somewhere in their chest regardless. Then the solo started. Beck had watched hundreds of guitar solos. He had played hundreds more. He knew what a solo was supposed to do: build, climax, resolve. He knew the vocabulary. What Jimi did with that wah pedal in the next 90 seconds fell outside every category Beck had available. He didn't use the pedal as effect. He used it as expression. Each sweep of the filter corresponded to something emotional: a cry on the upswing, a growl on the pullback, a question at the midpoint. The guitar wasn't making music. It was speaking. Not in the vague metaphorical sense that journalists use when they ran out of technical language. It was approximating the frequencies of a human voice, the formants, the vowels, something close to the consonants of a language without words. Beck recognized it the way you recognize something you've never seen before, but understand immediately. He had spent years trying to make his guitar sing. Jimi had made his guitar talk. By the time the song ended, the room had changed. The ambient noise that had been running underneath the performance had gone quiet somewhere in the middle of the second verse and never came back. There was a moment of complete silence after the final chord, then applause that sounded almost confused, like an audience uncertain whether what it had just witnessed was entirely allowed. Beck stood in the same spot. He didn't applaud. He wasn't sure what his hands were supposed to do. Later that evening, Chaz Chandler introduced the two of them. Jimi was warm, unassuming, almost shy in conversation. He mentioned that he'd listened to Beck's recordings back in the States, that certain things Beck had done had stayed with him. Beck heard the words and processed them from somewhere far away, the way you process information when part of your mind is still occupied with something else. He managed a few sentences. He doesn't remember exactly what he said. He remembers what he was thinking. He was thinking about the wah pedal, about the fact that he had held one in his hands and found it limited. And Jimi had picked up the exact same piece of gear and turned it into a second voice. Not a trick. A second instrument living inside the first one. The drive home was quiet. Beck had his own version of the evening assembling itself in his mind, and it was more complicated than he wanted to explain. He had built a reputation on a certain kind of mastery, knowing what an instrument could do, finding the edges. The wah pedal had seemed like limited territory. He had reached the edges in an afternoon and walked away satisfied. Jimi had shown him there were no edges, or that Beck had confused the walls he'd built inside himself with the walls of the room. In the weeks that followed, Beck practiced differently. Not more, differently. He started asking questions of his instruments he hadn't thought to ask before. What happens if this is not a tool but a voice? What happens if I stop using gear to achieve a sound and start using it to say something? The distinction seemed small. The difference in playing was enormous. He never tried to sound like Jimi. You didn't learn from Jimi Hendrix by copying Jimi Hendrix. You learned by watching how he thought about an instrument and applying that thinking to your own hands. The lesson wasn't in the notes. It was in the way Jimi looked at a piece of gear everyone else had decided they understood and found in it something the rest of them had walked right past. Beck's playing changed after that autumn. Not always visibly, but in ways other musicians noticed. A looseness in the phrasing, a willingness to let a note breathe, a relationship with silence that hadn't been there before. He rarely talked about why. In a 1985 interview, a journalist pressed him on the subject. They were discussing gear, tone, the evolution of Beck's sound through the 70s. The journalist mentioned Hendrix. Beck was quiet for a moment longer than the question required. Then he said something the journalist wrote down carefully. He said that before that night, he thought he understood what a guitar was for, that he had a complete picture of it in his mind, everything it could do, every sound it could make, and that watching Jimi play for 7 minutes rearranged that picture in a way he spent years trying to articulate and never quite managed. Not because the picture became larger, though it did, but because it stopped being a picture at all. It became something moving, something unfinished, something that kept changing shape depending on who was holding it. He said that the wah pedal specifically stayed with him, that it seemed like a small thing, a foot pedal, a piece of circuitry, but Jimi had used it like a word in a sentence, not a sound effect sitting on top of the music, like a word that only made sense in that exact position, spoken by that exact voice. And once you understood that an instrument could work that way, that every piece of gear you dismissed as a gimmick might be a word you hadn't learned yet, the whole map changed. The journalist asked if it had shaken his confidence. Beck thought about it. Then he said yes, for a while. But the more time passed, the less it felt like a threat, and the more it felt like a door. Someone had opened a door he hadn't known was there, and kept going, and Beck could either stand in the doorway or follow. He said he tried to follow. He said he was still trying. When Jimi died in September 1970, Beck was in the middle of recording. He heard the news and stopped playing for the rest of the day. Not out of ceremony, he just couldn't locate the thread of what he'd been doing. The music felt temporarily untethered, as if one of the points it had been quietly oriented toward had simply gone dark. He picked it back up the next morning. There was nothing else to do, but something in his attention was different from that day forward. More deliberate, as if he now carried the knowledge that even the people who redrew the map could disappear before they finished it. The wah pedal, 7 minutes in a London club. Something that looked like a footnote and turned out to be a lesson Beck spent the rest of his life absorbing. He never called himself the best after that autumn. People offered him the title regularly. He deflected it every time, usually with a half smile, usually without elaborating. He'd seen what the best looked like. He knew exactly what it cost to claim that word after November 1966. He had decided quietly that he would spend the rest of his career trying to deserve it, not achieving it, trying. Because Jimi had shown him that the trying never stopped, and that the guitarists who stopped were the ones who had confused the edges they'd built with the edges of what was actually possible. The room was always bigger than you thought. That was what the wah pedal had said, rocking under Jimi's foot in a small London venue more than 50 years ago, speaking in frequencies almost no one fully understood at the time. Beck understood it eventually. It took him years, but he got there. Some lessons arrive fast, some arrive in pieces, slowly, over the course of a life spent with your hands on a guitar, asking the same questions and getting different answers every time.